deliver on those important health objectives, or in which case, if they deliver in more access in more member states, obviously there will be an increase in access to those medicines. I mean, our impact assessment estimates a 15% access gain from this modulation. If there is more unmet medical needs and high unmet medical needs medicine, there will be more medicines catering to such diseases. We're talking about neurodegenerative diseases, certain infectious diseases, medicines that target antimicrobials. That in our evaluation and impact assessment, we've seen that today's system, unfortunately, is failing in these regards. I mean, just to give you a number from the impact assessment, out of 13 to 43 new medicines on average per year, only 4 to 20 of those are for unmet medical needs. And this is under today's definition. So if we're talking about unmet medical needs to really the highest morbidity, mortality, there we have even less options. And obviously, if a company comes with comparative clinical trials, it would really be able to give this information, avoid duplication, so that downstream actors are able to process, pricing and reimbursement decisions much quicker. But even in the case where, a company, for whatever reason, is not able to deliver on these public health objectives, we still have more access because, you have earlier generic entry. So that means more affordable options come more quickly to the market, which increases also access for patients. Now, obviously, in terms of innovation, as you've seen, the availability for companies for more incentives is actually raising the bar. Instead of 11 years, 10 plus 1 years that we have today, you would be able to go up to 12. So actually, there is more incentives on the table for those companies that actually deliver on these objectives. And if we have a pragmatic approach, and I believe, at least this is my opinion, that at least for the market launch there is a pragmatic approach, we will be seeing a change of let's say culture, and a change of interaction between member states and companies to actually see more innovation coming to the market. And of course, companies would be rewarded for that. So, I mean, this would be my first reaction to that.
Thank you, Anthony. And we fully understand indeed the motivation of the Commission behind this revision. And I will also ask Milan to give an answer to this question, sharing his perspective as patient representative.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you very much, Stefano. It is my pleasure to be today with all of you. It's a very interesting subject and a very concerning subject for the patient and patient advocates around Europe. But what is let's say tricky, or let's say what is the success of such a framework? Let's say I think that it depends from various factors, including how well the conditions are designed, implemented, and enforced. It is important to strike a balance between the incentivizing company to invest in innovation and ensuring affordability and accessibility of medicine for patients. Additionally, what I like to mention is the framework should consider the potential impact on the smaller pharmaceutical companies and generic manufacturers also, as well as the broader implication of for competition and the market dynamic within the EU pharmaceutical sector. I don't know, the introduction of the framework that link conditionally to have the potential to improve the access to the medicine and the foster EU innovation. Carefully consideration and evaluation of this implementation will be crucial to ensure it is efficiency and to avoid different kind of consequences for us like a patients. But what is most important, what we like to see from this regulation, like a patient advocates in the future, is that we know that in the moment we have so many shortcuts, not enough equality approach to all member states in the moment. But what is going to guarantee us in this framework that they will respect this legislation? How we will force the member states to incorporate this legislation in the national legislations? This is very important from the patient perspective for us. The second part is also that we know that a lot of countries is approaching to the European Union, member states who are like to be part of EU applicants. Do we have a consideration about also these countries who are approaching in this moment? You know, the market will be extended in the next period. We know how the European Medical Agency has in the regulation field what is for them also. This regulation is going to be a little bit changed in the framework of them also, and all the agencies what existing in the moment. And what was discussed with us, among us, with the patient group, what we noticed that we have so many regulation around different legislations in European Union who are not somehow directly connected with this regulation. Do this is going to be somehow updated in the future? Do we need to extend this? Also, not just like a review of the legislation who is existing, but what we are planning to do more to be efficiency in the future. Let's say this is for the start from my side.
Thank you, Milan, and this is very insightful. And while giving the floor to Fredrik and then Francis to answer, I will also leave the moderation to Alexander, who is with us now, and we can continue the discussion.
Thank you, Stefano. Apologies for being late. So over to you, I think, Fredrik, right?
So thank you, and welcome to the seminar, Alexander. So I think the question that you asked, Stefano, is basically sort of the extent to which there will be sort of this change in modulation in terms of incentives and exclusivity, if it's going to have an impact on innovation and the type of generation of new medicines that we'd like to see, especially in fields where innovation have tended to be insubstantial over the last decades or so. And I think my answer to the question is basically I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. I think in principle it's interesting to see the approach with a modulated approach where we basically opens the Pandora's box in order to try to find incentives targeting special type of directions that we would like to see in the pharmaceutical value chain. I'm in principle in favor of it, but I do acknowledge the difficulties that is going to emerge once you start to that. For instance, to start to define what is an unmet need, for instance, in the medicine space. But the other caution I think I would like to add here, of course, is that many of these unmet needs, they are unmet for pretty obvious reasons. And they are unmet because we're talking about extraordinarily complex areas where investments in scientific research hasn't been enough. We're talking about sort of diseases that are so complex that it's going to require very long periods of time in order to develop any type of drug that is going to be effective here. And if we start to sort of make changes to the system that are pretty marginal, I don't think we should expect that the consequences are going to be very substantial, given sort of the big challenge we have in sort of starting with investment in research and investments in science, and then we'll see sort of downstream what's going to come out of it. And I think this is also what we've been seeing over the last couple of decades, with a lot of companies voting with their feet, in the sense that they have canceled research laboratories, programs they've had in areas. There was a reference to neuroscience, for instance, which is notoriously complex, and it's difficult to see sort of how you make an investment decision and trying to estimate what type of product output you're going to have downstream in that value chain. And in sort of the aggregates that you're working with, the uncertainties that are there, the changes that are made, proposed to the system right now, I really don't see that they're going to have a significant impact on this development. I mean, if we're really serious about stepping into that area, we probably need to add much stronger incentives. And then we're talking about exclusivity periods and perhaps extending patents for a longer period of time for these type of areas where we'd like to see much more research development and of course product development over time. But then we are into a completely different type of time horizon, which I don't think the Commission or anyone else in Europe is contemplating for the moment.
Thank you very much, Fredrik, for bringing in that economic perspective. That's very valuable. Also, thanks, Milan, for bringing in the perspective of a patient organization and highlighting the difficulties to really implement legislation at the national level. It's really important that we're making sure that also at the national level we are making the right decisions about access. Last but not least, I would like to bring in the company perspective. It's a great pleasure to welcome Francis with us, Francis Peng, who heads market access in Orchard, a mid-sized small company from the UK. So Francis, over to you. What is your perspective on that introductory question?
Great. So thank you very much, Alexander and Stefano, and also EUCOPE for organizing the webinar. And you know, good afternoon and good evening to the people on the call today. You know, in terms of the industry perspective, I mean, I think it is reasonable for EU society to welcome any sort of legislation and incentives that aim to improve access and stimulate innovation. However, in this case, there does need to be predictability in the incentives for developers. And it's quite challenging actually to attach regulatory data protection to conditionalities, particularly the unmet medical need, and also the requirement to launch in all EU member states in a limited period of time. I mean, I think first of all, I think the proposed use of unmet medical need or even high unmet medical need may have quite restrictive interpretations. So, I mean, I think the use of concepts such as meaningful reduction of morbidity or mortality or exceptional therapeutic advancement introduces the notion actually of relativity. And, you know, if you can think to the world of rare diseases, that 95% of the 2,000 rare diseases out there do not even have an approved sort of treatment. So I think the definition of unmet medical need and high unmet medical need certainly does need addressing. It's already been mentioned by Antonius earlier about the evidence generation, the requirement of comparative evidence generation. It is quite challenging actually to generate evidence, for certain rare diseases. It may not be ethical or feasible to run such sort of studies, for example. And there has to be sort of some kind of open-mindedness in terms of study designs. And I would like to also highlight that when it comes to therapies that come to market, the first therapy that comes to market may not be able to address all the needs of the patients, and there may be a need for subsequent innovation as well. In terms of unmet medical need, if you have it sort of taking place at the European level, when it comes to the health technology assessment and price reimbursement at the national level, those considerations will also be sort of taking place too. So, you could have the assessment of unmet medical need being applied on multiple occasions, and this could also lead to variability across countries and inequity with access, right? Which is something that we're trying to sort of mitigate against now, I guess, with this particular reform. We're trying to ensure equity, with access, and hence this suggestion, to have the launch in all EU 27 member states, within 2 to 3 years after regulatory approval. When it comes to launching in all 27 sort of member states, it's actually not the complete decision of the developer. And there are various factors and determinants that shape access, such as national healthcare priorities, the healthcare infrastructure, the methodology actually, and actually how HTA bodies determine the value, for example. So it's actually not all within the control actually of the developer when it comes to launching in all 27 member states, although there could be the intention. I'd just like to sort of start there with my sort of opening comments. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Francis. Great to have you on board. And what I hear from almost all of you in addressing the challenges of the proposal is the difficulty to define an unmet medical need, or also to define a high unmet medical need, which is probably a very individual exercise, which is based very much on the need of the individual patients. If there's an unmet need, you can imagine that in oncology, patient might be non-responder in the first line therapy, and then another therapy comes along. So certainly there would be a high unmet medical need for that patient, but it's probably going to be very difficult to find an appropriate definition, taking all those individual needs into consideration when making that definition. Anyway, I'd like to move on to our second round of questions, where I would address a question to all of you individual. And I'd like to start with Fredrik. In your recent policy brief published by ECIPE, you made a wake-up call on the strategic autonomy and competitiveness of the EU innovative pharmaceutical sector. Could you share with us some key takeaways of that policy brief, and how you see these recommendations can be or takeaways can be taken up in the pharmaceutical package? Would be very interesting to hear from you how we could bring in those elements into the discussion.
Sure, Alexander. So, I mean, it's actually a very, very simple point that I've been trying to make together with a few colleagues in that paper, plus a series of things that we've done over the last years. One is a pretty obvious one, which is that when you look at a couple of number indicators on competitiveness in the pharmaceutical sector, in the broader biopharmaceutical sector, you're going to see that Europe is following a pattern of what we can call relative decline, which is that our share of broadly whatever aggregate you want to choose is going down. And there are a pretty couple of good reasons for why it's going down. I mean, one, of course, is that especially China, but a couple of other countries have substantially increased their investment into biopharmaceutical R&D. When you look at the innovation capacity of them, it's radically increasing. And just as we see in the broader global economy, the fact that the relative sizes of economies are changing means that Europe's part is going to go down. The problem, however, is that this trend has been pretty accelerated for Europe. And it's very much unlike the development that we've seen in the United States, leading me to believe that even if there are broader changes in the world economy, which is going to push sort of old type of economies that have been developed in mature economies for a long time, their share of the world economy is going to go down, or their share of world output in the pharmaceutical sector is going down. It's not an automatic process. It's clearly dependent on a couple of institutions and factors where you basically can work against the gravity in a way, and ensure that you have a continued highly competitive position in the sector. Even if the rest of the world is growing very, very fast. So when we look at, for instance, investment in biopharmaceutical R&D, when we look at the innovation for the launch of, or the emergence of new chemical and biological entities, when we look at the phase 1 submission pipeline, when we look at different types of selections of geographies of trials, we see there is an accelerated decline for Europe. Now, what can we do in order to reverse that trend, which I think is we would like to do? Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to pinpoint single type of policies that are going to have a substantial effect here. I think it's about the broader policy frameworks that we're choosing. And I like to think about, not just for this sector, but many other sectors, think about sort of policy in a portfolio sense, which is that you're going to be strong in some areas and you're going to be weak in some areas, just as you sort of would when you're looking at your pension savings, you are composing a portfolio which try to respond to different type of eventualities and scenarios, and you have strong assets, you have perhaps weaker assets in depending on what time you're looking at your portfolio, but we need to take sort of a portfolio effect looking at Europe as well. So what it is that we know? Well, we know that on pricing reimbursement issues, that's not a sort of strong suit for Europe when you look at competitiveness in terms of attracting R&D and attractive location of R&D centers. When you look at the liquidity of the market itself, you'll see that, well, there is a clear advantage of being sort of in the American market rather than being in the European market here. When we look at on patents, exclusivity, regulatory data protection, we'll see that sort of Europe has a relatively strong position, but it's not sort of very much stronger than you're going to find in other and similar parts of the world. And then we can start to look at many other policies and look at what the total portfolio composition looks like. And when we do that, I think there is sort of a good need for Europe to have a rethink about what it needs to do. And if we look at that rethink, I think we would start with looking at research spending, starting to look at what type of environments and ecologies that we're building up in Europe, where we allocate research funds, government research fund into the sector. We will begin to look at different type of investment incentives that exist in the sector. Human capital generation in terms of qualified personnel. We would look at capital markets regulation and see what can be changed there in order to have a capital market which is much more catering towards the type of value chain you have in the biopharmaceutical sector today, which is, of course, is highly M&A driven. It requires that you have different type of funding streams, which allows you to be operating a type of business which many of the old sort of businesses aren't really accustomed to. And then we will go into issues like patents, regulatory protection and exclusivity, and look at what can be done there in order to make the European system more attractive compared to other parts of the world. And I think that's necessary if Europe wants to be serious about sort of reversing that trend of a sort of gradually accelerated declining share for sort of the high R&D part of the sector. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to point to one specific policy or two or three specific policies. I think it's sort of the total framework which is going to be necessary here, because tinkering with small things are not going to do much. Yeah. You need to look at the big aggregates in order to have the output that you want to have.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Fredrik. And indeed, if you speak to colleagues in the US, there is a bit of a skepticism where things are moving, and I think Europe is looked at slightly differently in industry and on the other side of the Atlantic than it was probably 10 years ago. I mean, you rightfully highlight that the IP framework has been a robust framework in a way, but now we are putting some unpredictability around it in terms of conditionality. It is very important for companies to know early on, would I get 9 years or 10 years or 11 years of orphan exclusivity or regulatory data protection? So that's really a very important point. Very briefly, I would like to mention that we have a robust, I think, regulatory framework with the European Medicines Agency being able to adapt to the needs, as we've seen in the rolling review of the vaccines. We've been quick in issuing marketing authorizations and during pandemic times, and I think there are some hopefully positive elements in the EU HTA that one-stop shop industry wanted to see at some point in time. And also the clinical trial regulation will only really come into effect now that it's running for more than a year. So there's some hope that we would also get more clinical trials into Europe, but you highlight very important points about some shortcomings and uncertainties around where we are heading in terms of like the conditionality. Thank you for this. I'd like to move over to the patient perspective, to Milan. Ensuring faster patient access to innovative therapies, especially in underserved therapeutic areas, is one of the main objectives of the pharmaceutical package. And I think it is absolutely true. And I think we in industry see it likewise, that we need to do more in order to increase access in all member states. But before we're going there, I'd like to highlight one other thing, which is the high unmet medical need, the unmet medical need concept. So do you think the Commission proposal goes in the right direction? And will the definition of a high unmet medical need, will that be positively addressing the needs for people living with a rare liver disease?
Thank you very much for the question, Alexander. If the Commission proposal aims to ensure faster patient access to the innovative therapies, especially in underserved therapeutic areas, it aligns with important objective in the healthcare. Underserved therapeutic areas often represent medical needs that have limited or no available treatment options. Leaving patients without adequate solutions, prioritizing these areas can help to address the needs of the patients who have been, let's say, historically overlooked or have limited treatment options. The positive impact on people living with liver disease will depend on the specific, let's say, provision within the proposal and how well they address the unmet medical needs in this area. It is important to have a well-defined and comprehensive understanding of the medical needs specifically to the liver diseases, specifically to the liver disease. Considering the severity, prevalence, available treatment options, and so on. The definition of high unmet medical needs should take into account that input for healthcare professionals, patient advocacy groups, and experts in the field of liver disease. It should be robust enough to identify areas where innovation is most needed and encourage the development of therapies that can significantly improve the patient outcomes. The proposal for us, it's very important also the mechanism for expanded regulatory processes, streamlined reimbursement procedures, and appropriate pricing policies can future support faster patient access to the innovation therapies and underserved therapeutic areas, including rare liver diseases. This is what is from the patient perspective. I think that we see the unlimited needs.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, we have been also in the so-called OD expert group, the orphan drug expert group. We have been calling for modulation. We are very open for modulation to make sure that innovation is going into areas where there is whether we don't have any therapy alternatives. But also thanks for highlighting some of the difficulties around finding a proper definition for that, because it's a very big footprint or word, if I may say, the unmet medical need, which we're using in that concept. And I'd be happy to hear maybe also from Anthony from the Commission a little bit about this. But first, over to you, Francis, again. Small companies are the main drivers for biopharmaceutical innovation. What sort of incentive framework is needed to protect and reinforce these key players to ensure that the European Union remains attractive and a good place to invest, given also the competition which we have in global markets?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex, for the question. So I think developers would need a pharmaceutical package framework which has predictability first and foremost, right? I mean, I think, as you say, many developers of innovation are the small to medium-sized enterprises, right, which have very limited financial and human resources, right? And And I think sort of launching in all 27 member states, which is the launch conditionality, it could be quite unviable actually for many of those enterprises. And, you know, even in a country where the product is made available, you know, significant resources are expended in maintaining the license and actually taking care of some of the regulatory and pharmacovigilance commitments. So it is actually quite a significant undertaking, you know, when it comes to making a therapy available in a particular market. I mean, I think further, there are also practical barriers, right, for technologies such as, you know, ATMPs or those technologies for rare diseases. And, you know, you have small or non-existent populations in the case of rare diseases, or lack of suitable, you know, medical specialists, which might make it technically unfeasible to have, you know, a qualified treatment center for administration of the therapy in that particular country. So, in all, I mean, I think the you know, the launch conditionality could actually delay, could actually lead to a delay to a launch in the EU territory as a whole, you know, not just individual countries, which is the opposite of what the EU sort of pharmaceutical package was set out really to achieve. So it may actually cause the converse of what was anticipated. And, you know, I think there has to be flexibility or a longer allowance for launch conditionality, you know, if that is going to be the case, you know, respecting the circumstances of some of the small to medium-sized developers, right? You know, and you know, I think over the last couple of years, you know, there has been initiatives such as Prime, which have really sort of benefited small companies, you know, such as increased access to scientific advice, you know, more intensive interactions, reduced fees, you know, interactions between HTA and also EMA as well. And, you know, anything like that would certainly be very, very helpful if enhanced. I would like to certainly make a plug for streamlining the HTA processes and the evidence requirements, which can be quite demanding. And, you know, ultimately, health technology assessment agencies require the evidence in terms of making the reimbursement decisions, right? And it's not just the fees, you know, for the European Medicines Agency application, and also certain HTA applications now that are required, you know, such as NICE, for example, it started charging, you know, there's a fee for submitting. But the investment in evidence development, you know, and the preparation of the dossiers and the building of the health economic models, etc., can be quite significant, right? So I think all in all, having the predictability is what is most important. And I think some of the suggestions from, or proposals from the pharmaceutical package do kind of threaten that that predictability. So
thanks, Francis. It's really great to have you on board for this, because who would know better than you, being in charge of a product called Libmeldi, launched in many EU countries, wherever there is a center, to talk about the difficulties. And it's really good to hear from you where the challenges are. And I understand that the challenges are very much in the multiple filing for EU HTA, the multiple decision-making processes at the HTA level. And we hope that the EU HTA would partly help in that respect, but on the access part, we would still have to deal with national decision makers, as we all know. Great, really, also to have the European Commission on board. Anthony, so great you could make it for this session today. Thanks for accepting our invitation. So the European Commission's pharmaceutical package aims at, or the proposal aims at addressing the 3 A's: availability, affordability, and access. But it also looks at the 3 C's, which includes competition. Do you think you found the right balance between the 2 aspects, the 3 A's and the 3 C's, and in particular in keeping the EU competitive from a global level and attractive for especially small and mid-sized companies? Because we've seen a lot of innovation, especially in the field of rare diseases, stemming from small companies. I mean, some of those products have been bought by bigger companies. Some of the companies have been bought by bigger companies, but I would certainly say that innovation in the segment of rare diseases and orphan drugs is very often stemming from small and mid-sized companies. So happy to get your perspective, Anthony. Great to have you on board.
Thank you, Alexander. So, I mean, you said it yourself in a way. You know, this was a product of a balancing act. I mean, if I take you 2 years back to the pharmaceutical strategy and all the calls that we've had, you know, from the Council and, you know, from the European Parliament to deal with access, to deal with the shortages issue, to use the incentive system as a tool in order to achieve these objectives. And I think that there is no stakeholder today that questions the objectives. We're discussing semantics, how to implement this, how to make it more predictable, mitigate the downfalls, and increase the advantages. So, I mean, from our point of view, this had to be fact-based. So we had an evaluation, we had a very extensive consultation to first of all map the problems and then lay down the different policy objectives. Just to give you some background information, you know, there was a previous 2 summers ago where, you know, essentially we were mapping out 77 policy objectives that needed to be balanced around 3 different policy options, all of which would address the objectives. And what we went for was really a quid pro quo approach, because, you know, you couldn't go through an obligation type of option, and neither it would be, let's say, too expensive to just go with just carrots in the system. So you needed to have a balance. I believe that this balance, you know, as hard as it could be, has achieved the following. First of all, building on something that was said earlier, I mean, I think we're building on the strengths of the EU. You know, first of all, we have in the EU a very strong, robust intellectual property protection system, which remains in terms of, you know, IP, patent protection, and the supplementary protection certificates. These are there. You know, a developer going into investment today will know that they will get their 20 plus up to 5 years SPC. Obviously, we needed to use a tool in order to deliver on the access objectives. So the modulation seemed the most appropriate approach. And we have built in pragmatic elements into these mechanisms so that there is, I mean, certainly there is legal certainty because the rules are clear, but also that there is a level of predictability. Obviously, if you go into the business of developing medicines, intrinsically, you have a certain level of unpredictability. You don't know if you're doing an orphan medicine, you don't know if you're going to get a orphan designation. You're not even sure if your medicine will be authorized in the end, right? I mean, this is part of the game. However, it is possible to plan ahead, and it is possible, you know, through certain post-implementation work to make the rules more succinct and more clear. Commenting on the high unmet need question, for instance, I mean, there were discussions, should we make a list? You know, these are the diseases, the indications for which we call unmet medical needs. But, you know, if we went for such an approach, the minute a new medicine came out, the list would be already out of date. So in the legislation, we needed to be broad enough, so in order to be future proof, and at the same time, we need to specify further those rules. And you will see in the legislation that, you know, the agency will come up with certain scientific guidelines that will be regularly updated in order to provide this clarity that a developer would need it. We've also built in the consultation mechanism with downstream actors, you know, so that HTA authorities and pricing authorities also, let's say, have a say into what is, for instance, unmet medical need. But this is not just it. I mean, when I was saying building on strengths, the legislation incorporates a lot of other elements that build on the EU's strength. You know, we had Prime today with EMA, which we're building on. The rolling reviews, this phased review process that we're also building into the legislation. Electronic product information, you know, the sandboxes. These are things that we can achieve together in the EU, building on our industrial basis. But also we needed to mitigate our weaknesses, right? So the reform of the EMA, the simplification of the system to avoid duplications, to make authorizations faster. You know, we're reducing the time, bringing us closer to other regions. These are some of the weaknesses that everyone sees, and that, you know, they're being addressed through this reform. We just came out of a pandemic. You know, we saw the threat of nationally approved medicines coming in, and all sorts of discrepancies. Now there is a temporary emergency marketing authorization, you know, in the case that we have such situations in the future. I mean, I can go on and on with all these simplifications. So these are addressing really the weaknesses in our current system, making it more competitive and really in a more attractive destination. And just finally, to say a couple of words on whether or not a company in the future under this new system would decide to invest in the EU. We need to look at the broader picture. It's not just the pharma reform. You know, I mentioned we have a stable IP setting. There is a huge change coming in with the European health data space and the use of data generally for regulatory decisions, which is also part of this reform, you know, recognizing real world evidence as part of the regulatory decisions. So in terms of regulatory support, I think all the elements are there to put European businesses in the forefront of this global race, and, you know, making specific additional support, giving additional support to small and medium-sized enterprises, whether that's, you know, more time to launch products, more time to prove the launch, additional regulatory support. All these elements are there, and of course we remain available, you know, in this next phase of the interinstitutional negotiation to fine-tune the system, because I mean, at least from what I see, there is general agreement, at least from regulators, that, you know, this is a good basis for a discussion, and, you know, let's try to fine-tune it so that everyone wins in a way.
Thanks so much. I mean, thanks also really for highlighting it's not easy to strike the balance, we know that, and there are various different interests which need to be taken into consideration. I would absolutely agree with you that in some other areas the Commission is clearly moving in the right direction. The European health data space, as I mentioned before, we have a robust regulatory system which is adaptive to the needs, and also we need to wait and see what the clinical trial regulation will bring, what the EU HTA will bring. So there are various elements where I think we are moving potentially in a good direction. However, one point, and I see we have one question in the chat, and we're coming to a close at some point in time. One element which is clearly important is somewhat the concept of unmet and high unmet medical need, which is a judgment call, which is seen globally. And I've heard a lot of companies, also from global companies, saying that, well, that's a big concept. And if I have that brand mark of not having an unmet medical need or not having a high unmet medical need, I will have issues in finding a good price around the world, because it's such a big wording, it's such a big concept. And we have been clearly highlighting, together with other stakeholders in the OD expert group, that we are open for modulation. So what you're mentioning, Anthony, the need to adapt our system for the needs which we see in the future to address the 95% of rare diseases is clearly there. There's no doubt. We also need to do something with access. We just question, do we need to use such a big concept, which, if the criteria are not met, might indeed deter companies or defer companies from launching in Europe, because it's a big judgment call for a product which is seen globally and which is a brand mark for national pricing discussions, national negotiations, and so on. And I would think that payers would have to have a stake in the definition as well, but we do hope that it's not only 2 products per year coming out with that stem, and we do hope that actually that wouldn't defer innovation from Europe. So that's a point which I think is very relevant. This concept has a very big footprint, if I may repeat myself in that concept. Thanks for that. I think we have a question which is directly related to that, and I'm looking at time. But the question is, why is unmet medical need directly related to mortality and morbidity instead of more positive criteria like improving quality of life? That's probably not an easy one for you to answer, Anthony, but I just wanted to spell it out to bring in the audience. If you don't have the perfect solution for this, this is of course fully understood. It's a difficult thing to define.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if the concept of unmet need is totally new. I mean, obviously we have already unmet medical need in the context of the current rules, which is linked to conditional marketing authorization. Obviously, the stakes are much lower, compared to what the new concept would bring. But and this, I mean, also the definition that we've developed, it's not, for us, it's a criterion-based definition. So it's not a full definition. It requires further work in order for someone to operationalize it, if you will. But that was, as I said earlier, that was the only option in our hands in order to enshrine it in legislation without making it obsolete from the first day the legislation would come into effect. And I think this is something that one could understand. Now, in terms of morbidity and mortality, these are already concepts that are used in the EU medicines regulatory network today. The difference here is that now it's being, in a way, enshrined in legislation, and there needs to be scientific guidance as to what that means exactly. And I think that once we have that additional step, this add-on, if you will, this will make things much more clear for the company that wants to invest in these areas. There is obviously now a little bit of a fear of the unknown, and this is understandable. But the goal is to have everything in place for the implementation of the legislation, so that then we have a full picture. But in any case, in order to have a future-proof criterion-based definition, we need to have a degree of openness into what we have in the legislation.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Really, thanks for highlighting those points. I think that we're running out of time here. I think maybe we have time for one more question. And I know we're out of time, but we started a bit later. If you have 5 minutes in addition, it would be much appreciated. The last question, and then I would probably sum it up, is how can an unmet need be defined on EU level if the national treatment landscape might be highly different unmet need per European country? Of course, it's a bit like the same if choosing a comparator that might look very different from country to country. And if, for example, we look at beta thalassemia, which many people call the Mediterranean disease, the prevalence is much higher in Greece, Cyprus, Italy, and Spain. So I think that's a very good question. Maybe, I don't know who wants to follow up on this one. Maybe Milan, a quick wording on this one, and I don't know, Fredrik, Francis, and Anthony, whoever wants to come in very quickly. If I may ask you for a quick answer in 2 sentences. Milan, do you want to take this one? Is that okay for you? Difficulties to define an unmet medical need given the different territories and prevalence of diseases.
How can I need to be defined on EU level if the national treatment landscape may be highly different? This is the question, yes.
Yes, that's a question. Yeah. I don't know if you want to take it. If you don't want.
Be defined. This is from a liver perspective I mentioned previously. I think that the problem is that every area need to be, when we speak about define of high unmet medical needs, should take into account that the input for healthcare professionals, patient advocacy groups, and experts in the field of the disease, especially in every disease, need to qualify the special unmet needs. For us, for the liver disease, or something else. For I don't know, for different type of cancer or something else, unlimited needs in the moment. What we have it on the table, what we expecting in the future, what we like to get from this regulation also for unlimited needs, especially because we are speaking here a lot of things somehow to connect. I noticed one thing, unlimited need. What is unlimited need in EU level? When you have so many different bodies and agencies in Europe who are somehow not connected, it's coming on the end. We have a subcommittee. We have a committee, ENVI committee, which is covering the health and environment, but we have now a subcommittee for health, but this is the direction where are we going to cover unlimited needs in the future, because the legislations which is giving us for the research development in the future and the access for the innovation which we like to achieve, especially for the patients in the member states, depends of a lot of specificity of the severity of the prevalence of a lot of different things can be categorized. What is most unlimited need for some kind of disease? What I like to mention is everything is going in that direction. It is good. The European Commission is open the doors for general for health. That's all these possibilities which are giving now in the moment, which they try to address these challenges with the unlimited needs of the patient, the shortcuts, what they exist in the moment. They can give us a completely new perspective, gathering all stakeholders in one place, and let's say maybe for the future to all, from the patient perspective, let's say to open the door directly with the sector, completely with the committee who is going to be dedicated in the health and will cover a lot of these topics, and to see the challenges who is going to provide all these agencies who are existing in the moment, and initiatives like EU Cancer Beating Ground, EU Health Program, Horizon for research and everything. Do this is enough? Do this private public partnership are open for us enough to cover the unlimited needs in the future? How to select them and to open the space for the patient advocates to understand, and the patient, generally the patient, to understand what is going to be the cover from the companies, where they find themselves in this space, because this space is somehow with the bubbles in the air, many bubbles, different bubbles in the air. What's mean EU for us? What's mean for the other, for the member states, regulations and everything? We mentioned in the beginning that we need to incorporate many different legislation, maybe to this regulation in the moment, to reconsider it. And I don't know, a lot of perspectives I'm seeing in this like a patient advocate, but for me it's open that, like mentioned Antonio, this is really open space for us, like a patient advocates, to really to discuss for our unlimited needs.
Sure, thank you very much. I just wanted to mention, and this is also starting to wrap up, I just wanted to mention that we don't want to criticize the concept in itself, but we just wanted to highlight the fact that it's a very individual decision, and also that there are spillover effects which lead into pricing and reimbursement, which will lead into access to medicines. And also we wanted to highlight the fact that this has global implications, because it's a very big word of having or not having an unmet medical need. If you're not having it, you might in some countries always almost be treated like a generic. But anyway, we will have a second session or episode about this. We will have 2 more episodes of this new format. I would like to thank very much Stefano Romanelli in EUCOPE, who has been putting this all together, who has been very helpful in sharing the first part of today's sessions. I would like to sincerely apologize for the technical difficulties and the delay we had in starting this session for 10 minutes. Shouldn't happen again. I would like to thank you all very much for your perspectives. We had the perspective of a patient organization, we had an industry representative, we had an economic perspective, and we had the commission perspective. And I would like to close really highlighting that I think we are all aligned that we need to have a certain predictability around incentives and IP rights, that it is probably not very easy to define unmet medical need. And ultimately, that access is not only a company decision, it is also a decision taken by the healthcare system and the individual payer in the individual countries. I think that's something, Francis, you have highlighted. It's a very important point, and I think also the Commission, when the proposal was presented, highlighted to the various stakeholders, which is not only industry, it's also patient organizations, but it's also healthcare systems which make decisions about access. And I think that's a very important, and we need to consider that, bearing that in mind. Once again, thank you all very much for being with us, for staying 10 minutes longer. Apologies for the delay. We are looking forward to the continued discussion with the Commission, with the patient organization, of course, with our constituency, our members, the pharmaceutical industry, and also with important institutions like the institution Fredrik is representing, ECIPE, about economic issues. Thanks so much for being with us. Also to the audience, thanks for your questions and comments. We will be back with a second episode in the coming weeks, and thank you very much. And I would like to close this session today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.